Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back into the medieval world. And before you get too comfortable, you should know that it will be noisy, smelly, drafty, and probably more dangerous than you ever imagined. So yes, the warning is real. You probably would not last a single day here, but at least we can enjoy the view together as a slow, strange bedtime adventure. And so, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because that way I know I am whispering this history to the right people. And while you are at it, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. Because I love seeing the patchwork of sleepy travelers drifting in from every time zone. And now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together, where you find yourself standing just outside the wooden gates of a medieval village, the kind you might picture from an old manuscript illustration. Though the real thing feels heavier and smellier, with damp straw underfoot, smoke curling from chimneys that lean at awkward angles, and a guard at the gate who does not look especially interested in letting you pass. Yet somehow he does anyway, probably because he assumes you are not important enough to cause trouble. And so you step into the muddy lane, where chickens flap madly at your ankles, a pig darts by with what appears to be a stolen cabbage in its mouth, and somewhere overhead a crow caws in a tone that feels suspiciously judgmental, as if it has seen this exact scenario play out before. Though it is worth noting that while historians agree that village gates were common, they still debate just how strictly guarded they were, since some records suggest a more casual flow of people. But in this case, your imagination has delivered you a stern gatekeeper, and now you are committed to it, and the unmistakable rhythmic thud of someone chopping firewood, which is oddly comforting until you realize you might be asked to help with such chores yourself, though of course you would fail spectacularly because you have the arm strength of someone who has spent more time scrolling than chopping, and as you wander further, a woman tosses the contents of a chamber pot out of a window, narrowly missing your shoulder, which makes you grateful for your modern plumbing. Though it does give you a sense of just how fragrant these narrow lanes must have been, and it raises the question which historians often puzzle over, about whether medieval people simply did not notice the smell anymore, or if their tolerance for such aromas was just considerably higher than yours. Either way, you are wrinkling your nose as discreetly as possible, because blending in seems wise, though your clothes probably already give you away. And as you take in the crooked wooden houses, some patched with wattle and daub, that looks as though it could collapse if you sneeze too loudly, you notice the strange rhythm of life here, where daylight dictates everything, and where the sound of a distant church bell already pulls people into their daily tasks. Though for you, just surviving the sensory overload of this first arrival feels like an achievement. And yet there is a certain charm in the chaos, the way the smoke catches the early sunlight, the way the rooster crows with a kind of proud futility, and the way the villagers, suspicious though they are, seem entirely absorbed in the business of keeping themselves alive, leaving you free to slip deeper into the medieval dreamscape, though you may already suspect that by the end of the day you will be begging to go home if the mud and the chamber pots do not finish you off first. And yet here you are, still walking, still curious, and perhaps already a little too tired. The first few moments in the village already had you feeling out of place, but as you step away from the gate and wander down the narrow lane, the noise of the marketplace begins to draw you in like a magnet, and before long you find yourself standing at the threshold of chaos. Because if you thought the pigs and chickens outside the gate were disorderly, wait until you see an entire market day in motion, with stalls crammed along the main street, vendors shouting in accents you can barely decipher, the smell of fish competing with the pungent tang of sheep manure, and somewhere in the background the crackle of a roasting spit, reminding you that food in the medieval world was never entirely separated from smoke and grease. Though before you can even orient yourself, a boy barrels past carrying a basket of onions, one or two of which fall into the mud at your feet, and when you try to hand them back, he just glares at you as though you have ruined his entire family fortune, which sets the tone rather neatly for what it feels like to be a stranger in a medieval market. There is no friendliness committee waiting with a welcome basket, only suspicion, loud haggling, and the very real risk of being trampled by a goat, though you cannot help but find the spectacle oddly mesmerizing, because every sense is assaulted at once, from the squawking geese tied together by their legs, to the sharp clink of iron tools laid out on a blanket, to the way a cloth merchant waves a length of wool under your nose as though the smell alone should convince you to buy it. And of course you do not least because you have no medieval coins in your pocket, which makes you realize how fragile your survival here truly is. For currency is not just money, but permission to belong. And without it, you are as suspicious as a thief, though you may find comfort in the fact that even medieval people sometimes relied on bartering. So theoretically, you could trade your modern sneakers for a week's supply of cabbages, but then again, you might also be burned as a witch for possessing footwear stitched in a way no one has ever seen before, which is a risk best avoided. So instead, you watch from the sidelines, trying to look as though you are simply contemplating whether a wheel of slightly furry cheese might be worth the gamble. And as you do, you cannot help but marvel at the layers of history playing out here, because while markets like this seem quaint to you, they were lifelines for medieval communities bringing together goods from distant towns, sometimes even from far-off lands, with salt from the coast, spices trickling in from eastern trade routes, and fabrics dyed in colors far richer than the muddy earth tones of the countryside. And yet alongside this global exchange, you also notice the hyper-local details, like the farmer's daughter scolding her father for short-weighing the beans, or the blacksmith loudly claiming his nails will never bend, which you strongly doubt. And these little glimpses give the market its character, halfway between survival necessity and social theater. Because yes, people came here to buy their bread and their turnips, but they also came to gossip, to meet potential spouses, to overhear news, and to speculate on why the reeve has been limping this week. And in that sense, the market was not so different from your own modern shopping centers, except with significantly more mud and considerably fewer lattes. And as you press deeper into the crowd, a fishmonger suddenly waves a trout directly under your nose, its glassy eyes daring you to appreciate its freshness. Though you step back quickly, reminding yourself that refrigeration was not a thing here, and that fresh might simply mean it was caught earlier this week, rather than earlier this morning, which adds a whole new dimension to dinner planning. And while you are thinking this, a friar wanders by, rattling a donation box, offering blessings in exchange for coins, and you cannot help but admire the business model, since his overhead is practically zero. Though you also notice a beggar crouched by the wall with a tin cup, ignored by almost everyone, and it strikes you how survival here is a daily performance. Some people projecting abundance, others masking desperation, all while trying to keep up appearances in a world where famine and disease are never far away. And just as you start to feel overwhelmed, a minstrel strums a lute and sings a bawdy ballad that makes two nearby matrons tut disapprovingly, though they do not move away, which tells you the market is as much about entertainment as it is about trade. And for a fleeting moment, you almost forget how uncomfortable you are until you trip over a loose cobblestone and nearly land face first in a basket of live eels, which thrash with the kind of energy you have not had since arriving. And you steady yourself, cheeks burning as though you have just been caught doing something forbidden, though the truth is, the market barely noticed you. And perhaps that is the most humbling part of all, because here you are, a visitor from the future, with all your modern comforts, and yet you are invisible. Just one more figure dodging chamber pot water, haggling over dubious bread, and trying to pretend you belong in a place that would chew you up in less than a day. And as you stand there heart-pounding from eel-related embarrassment, you cannot help but ask yourself whether you would even make it to sundown if this were your reality, or whether the market alone, with its noise, its stench, and its relentless pace, might be enough to wear you out completely. Though of course you press on because curiosity is stronger than fatigue, and because something about the absurdity of it all, the geese honking like out-of-tune trumpets, the friar jingling his box like a medieval street performer, the cheese merchant swearing his mold is a sign of quality, has you strangely hooked, and so you continue wandering deeper into the market maze, knowing full well that you are hopelessly unprepared, but at least mildly entertained, which is the closest thing to survival you have achieved all morning. You have barely survived the market without being flattened by livestock or accidentally purchasing 3 questionable wheels of cheese, and now your stomach reminds you that it has been some time since you last ate, though you quickly discover that medieval hunger does not end with a drive-through window or a neatly sealed bag of chips, but rather with an invitation to a peasant household where breakfast is more of a stern negotiation with what little is available than the comforting spread you may be used to. So you duck your head under the low lintel of a wooden cottage and immediately find yourself enveloped in a haze of smoke that seems to drift freely between ceiling beams, lingering in the air until your eyes water. And you realize that chimneys are a rare luxury here, which means the fire in the center of the room vents itself directly into your lungs, creating a kind of medieval sauna that nobody asked for, though the family inside seems unbothered, so you cough politely into your sleeve while pretending this is perfectly fine. And then you are offered a seat at a trestle table that wobbles dramatically whenever anyone leans too hard. And you are presented with a loaf of bread so dense it could double as a defensive weapon. The crust dark from being baked in a communal oven that still held the ashes of yesterday as fire. And when you bite into it, you nearly chip a tooth, realizing that flour in this era is rarely sifted, often full of grit and tiny bits of stone from the millstones, which means you are essentially gnawing on artisanal sandpaper. And you wonder how anyone kept their teeth beyond the age of 20, though to be fair, many did not. And as you chew this geological sample disguised as breakfast, a child slides a jug of ale towards you, and you hesitate because it is not yet noon. But then you remember that ale is safer than water here, since streams are often full of delightful extras like animal waste and rotting fish. So you take a cautious sip and find it surprisingly light, almost sweet, though definitely not the craft beer you may have been imagining. And while you are still processing this, your host laughs and asks if you are enjoying your liquid bread, which is both accurate and slightly unsettling, and you smile weakly, trying not to choke, while they continue dunking their bread into the ale as though this is the most natural thing in the world. And in a way it is, because for peasants, this is fuel for a long day of labor, not a leisurely indulgence. And here is where you start to feel the first true weight of survival, because the meal is not designed to please you. It is designed to keep you upright and capable of hauling, digging, or threshing for the next 12 hours, which means flavor is optional and calories are mandatory. And so you sit there gnawing and sipping, watching smoke curl into your eyes, listening to the fire crackle and the hens outside peck at the mud. And you cannot help but notice how small the cottage feels. One room for everything: sleeping, eating, storing tools, sometimes even keeping animals indoors when the weather turns cruel. And this tight space hums with the rhythm of survival. From the mother stirring a pot of yesterday's pottage on the fire, to the father patching a leather shoe by the window, to the grandmother muttering a prayer while threading beads through her fingers. And you realize that everyone here has a role, a duty, and none of them include entertaining you. So you try not to draw too much attention as you wipe crumbs from your lap, though you are already conspicuous because your hesitation with the ale has marked you as someone suspiciously delicate. And in the Middle Ages, delicacy is a liability. So you force down another gulp to prove your resilience, but your stomach is less convinced, churning quietly in protest, which makes you wonder whether the historian accounts of constant stomach trouble in this period are really just euphemisms for the state you are now experiencing firsthand. And while you ponder this, you overhear the family casually discussing the possibility of rain, which may ruin the barley if it comes too early, and this simple exchange drives home the precariousness of their lives, where every drop of weather dictates survival. Every loaf of bread is a gamble against famine, and every morning begins with the question of whether today's labor will keep the household fed tomorrow. And that thought weighs heavier than the bread itself, though you cannot help but find humor in the little details, like the toddler chewing on a carrot stub, with more enthusiasm than you can muster for your ale, or the dog lurking hopefully under the table, despite the fact that nothing of value will ever be dropped, because food waste is nearly non-existent here, a concept you realize modern people could learn from, though perhaps without the stone-filled bread. And as the meal winds down, you feel oddly grateful, not because you are full, far from it, but because you have been allowed to share a glimpse of ordinary survival, and in its own smoky, tooth-endangering way, it is almost beautiful. Though the sarcastic voice in your head whispers that, if this is breakfast, you will not last until dinner, and you laugh quietly, hoping no one notices, before rising unsteadily from the wobbly bench and preparing to face the endless chores of the day, already missing your cereal and your coffee, but strangely determined to carry on at least until the next chamber pot incident sends you running for the safety of the 21st century. You step out of the smoky little cottage with your stomach grumbling from the stone-riddled bread and your head buzzing faintly from the ale. And before you can even wipe the soot from your eyes, you are handed a wooden bucket, a very heavy wooden bucket at that, and told in no uncertain terms that it is time to help with the morning chores, which sounds simple enough until you realize that chores in a medieval village are not the kind you can delay with a polite email or outsource to a gadget, but rather the kind that determine whether the family eats, whether the livestock survives, and whether you collapse face first into the mud before noon. So you take the bucket, with as much dignity as you can muster, and begin following the peasant father down a narrow track towards the fields. Though you notice almost immediately that the ox trudging ahead of you seems to know the route better than you do, pausing only to flick its tail lazily at flies, and you cannot help but feel slightly insulted by the ease with which the animal plods through the muck compared to your stumbling steps, which squelch noisily in shoes not remotely designed for medieval mud. And as you slip for the third time, you wonder whether medieval farmers secretly judged newcomers by how many times they could remain upright in a row, though you also recall that oxen were considered more valuable than most humans in this era, a fact both sobering and mildly humiliating as you clutch your bucket like a prop in a play where everyone but you knows the lines. And when you finally reach the edge of the field, you are presented with a wooden-handled tool, something between a hoe and a rake, that looks innocent enough until you try to use it, at which point you discover that the soil is stubborn, clumpy, and filled with stones that make your teeth rattle each time the blade strikes, while the peasant family, seasoned by years of this rhythm, move with steady efficiency, hacking, turning, and muttering about the weather, while you stand there red-faced and sweating after about 30 seconds, realizing that your gym membership has prepared you for precisely none of this. And here is where the sarcastic little thought sneaks in, reminding you that you, the proud survivor of streaming marathons and desk chair slouching, would never last a day doing this, though you soldier on partly out of pride and partly out of fear that someone will notice your laziness, because even in this sleepy village, everyone contributes from the smallest child scaring birds away with a rattle made of sticks to the grandmother gathering herbs for supper. And there is no space for useless visitors, which makes you double your efforts, sweat dripping down your nose, as the ox snorts disapprovingly nearby, as if mocking your feeble attempts at productivity. And somewhere in the haze of labor, you recall a fact you once read that medieval peasants spent more calories working than they consumed in their meals, which makes you pause and wonder whether you are currently burning through yesterday as handful of turnips faster than you can replace it. A terrifying arithmetic that underscores why famine could devastate entire villages with ease. And yet in the midst of this exhausting cycle, you find strange moments of beauty, like the skylark darting overhead, singing a cheerful tune that feels wildly inappropriate for the sweat dripping into your eyes, or the way the morning sun paints long shadows across the furrows, catching the glint of dew on blades of grass, reminding you that even toil has its poetry, though your back quickly interrupts this reverie with a sharp twinge, pulling you back into the reality that you are soft, spoiled, and entirely unsuited to this existence. And you try to laugh at yourself, though it comes out as more of a wheeze, which the peasant father kindly pretends not to notice, instead handing you a second tool as if doubling your workload might magically transform you into a competent farmhand. And you attempt once more, gritting your teeth as your arms tremble, realizing that historians who write about the rhythm of the agricultural calendar are speaking politely about a lifetime of backbreaking effort, one where rest comes only when daylight fades and the body simply refuses to move anymore. And you imagine what it must feel like to be born into this, to know no alternative, to take for granted that survival means endless repetition of the same gestures, digging, planting, mending, hauling, until the cycle resets again with the seasons, and though you can barely lift the tool, you sense a kind of steady dignity in the way these peasants accept their lot, even joke about it, laughing at the stubborn ox or the crow that dares to snatch a seed, and you realize that humor is perhaps the only salve against monotony, which explains why medieval records are filled with sly jokes and bawdy tales, told even in the harshest conditions. And maybe that is the real survival tool you lack, the ability to laugh while swinging a hoe for hours on end, though for now you focus on simply surviving the next few minutes without collapsing, your breath ragged, your arms screaming, and your stomach loudly regretting every sip of ale. And as the morning drags on, the work shifts seamlessly from field to barnyard, where you are introduced to the joy of mucking out stalls, a task that involves more straw, more shoveling, and far more smells than you care to catalogue, though you endure it gamely, partly because fresh straw underfoot feels strangely pleasant after the sticky mud, and partly because complaining would achieve nothing but further embarrassment. And somewhere amid the relentless cycle of lifting, carrying, and slipping, you discover that the ox truly is stronger and smarter than you. Because while you are flailing to balance a bucket of water, the beast casually nudges a trough into place with its horns, spilling not a drop, and you stand there dripping, humbled, wondering whether the animal is secretly smirking at you. And by the time the sun climbs higher, you are so thoroughly drenched in sweat, mud, and possibly cow saliva that you can hardly remember what clean clothes feel like. But you also realize that you have stumbled into one of the greatest truths of medieval life, which is that chores are not a distraction from living. They are living itself, every gesture tied to survival. And though you will likely collapse long before noon, there is something strangely grounding about this relentless rhythm, as if the mud under your boots and the weight in your arms connect you to centuries of forgotten laborers whose names are never written in chronicles, but whose sweat built the world. And for one dizzy, exhausted moment, you almost feel proud to join their ranks, until you drop the bucket directly on your foot and yelp loudly enough to startle the chickens, undoing whatever dignity you had briefly claimed, and you limp back toward the cottage, aching in muscles you did not know existed, realizing that if this is only the morning, the afternoon will almost certainly finish you off. Though perhaps not before you collapse face first into the nearest haystack, finally admitting that survival here demands more than curiosity. It demands endurance you simply do not have. The ache in your arms has barely begun to dull when a sound rises over the thatched rooftops, low at first, then resonant enough to make the ox pause mid-chew, and the chickens flap in a startled chorus, a single bell tolling from the stone tower at the center of the village. And though to your ears it carries a rather ominous, something bad is about to happen tone, the peasants around you do not look alarmed at all. Instead, they straighten up, wipe their brows with rough sleeves, and murmur quietly as if reminded of an appointment they could not dare miss. And it dawns on you that this is not a warning, but a call, the daily rhythm of the medieval church bell, summoning everyone, whether tired, filthy, or in the middle of chasing runaway pigs. Because in this world the bell is the clock, the calendar, and the stern reminder that time belongs not to you but to God, and you follow the others almost automatically, half curious, half relieved to be given an excuse to stop digging, limping slightly from your bucket incident, though you try to look pious rather than pitiful, as you shuffle along the muddy lane, passing cottages where women hurry to cover pots on the fire, and children are herded toward the same direction, and soon the crowd swells, all roads funneling toward a squat stone church that looks far too small to contain so many people, its walls streaked with moss and its wooden door worn shiny where generations of hands have pushed it open, and you pause on the threshold, hit with a sensory wave so different from the open fields that it almost knocks you back. The heavy smell of wax, damp stone, and unwashed humanity pressed together in an enclosed space, the faint shimmer of colored light where sun struggles through a narrow stained glass window, and the constant murmur of voices quickly hushing into silence as a robed figure steps toward the altar, lifting his hands with practiced gravity, and suddenly you are part of a ritual older than your imagination, one where every gesture has meaning, though you understand almost none of it, because the Latin chant that follows might as well be a spell, its syllables rolling and echoing while peasants bow their heads and cross themselves with devotion that makes you feel both out of place and oddly soothed, like you have stumbled into a lullaby written for a community that knows exactly where it belongs. And as you stand awkwardly at the back, trying to mimic the movements without hitting anyone in the face, you notice how the entire atmosphere is designed to humble. Towering ceilings, or what passes for towering here, flickering candles that make shadows dance like restless spirits, and a stern crucifix gazing down with eyes that seem just a little too judging for your comfort. And yet beneath the solemnity, there is a faint hum of ordinary life refusing to stay silent. Babies fussing, someone coughing so violently you fear for their lungs, and it strikes you that this is less about perfection and more about presence, about reminding everyone daily that survival depends not just on food and toil, but on shared belief, whether or not you happen to believe it yourself. And while you are pondering this, the priest launches into a sermon, his voice carrying with surprising authority for someone who has probably eaten less breakfast than you. And though his words are lost to you in language, you catch the rhythm of his cadences, rising and falling with practiced intent. And you remember that medieval priests were often the only literate figures in a village, guardians of knowledge who might just as easily terrify as comfort. Because with literacy comes power, and with power comes the ability to shape how people see the world, which is a heavy thought to sit with while your legs begin to cramp. But you force yourself to keep watching, and you notice the villagers nodding, sighing, responding with murmured amens at intervals, proof that they find meaning even if you cannot, though perhaps you find meaning too in a strange way. Because for the first time since arriving, you are still surrounded not by chaos or chores, but by a silence broken only by chant and bell. And it is almost calming until the incense kicks in, and you begin to cough discreetly into your sleeve, realizing that medieval piety smells strongly of smoke and herbs, which makes you imagine how many peasants fainted mid-service and chalked it up to divine ecstasy rather than poor ventilation. And the thought nearly makes you chuckle, though you wisely swallow it down because the stern woman next to you looks like she could drag you outside by the ear. And you remember reading once that church attendance was not just spiritual, but social surveillance. Everyone watching who showed up and who did not, who fumbled their gestures and who knew their prayers by heart, and that reminder chills you even as sweat beads at your temples, because you realize how little privacy existed here, how faith and community were intertwined so tightly that stepping out of rhythm could mark you forever. Yet at the same time, you admire the sheer artistry of it all. The carved wooden saints, the flicker of light catching a gilded chalice, the rhythm of voices rising together as if the village itself becomes one heartbeat. And for a brief moment, you let yourself lean into that collective tide, imagining how comforting it must be to feel so certain of your place in the universe. No questions, no doubts, just ritual, repetition, and the promise that someone higher has a plan, even if it involves endless hoeing and the occasional famine. But just as you start drifting into that calm, the service ends abruptly. The final bell strikes, and suddenly the crowd surges like a tide released, everyone chatting, greeting, and gossiping in the churchyard, as if they have been waiting all morning for this moment. And indeed they have. For here the church is less about abstract theology than about the chance to see neighbors, to hear news, to exchange bread recipes or whisper rumors. And you find yourself swept into clusters of conversation, half of which involve speculation about the weather, because of course it does, but also stories of distant wars and kings whose names the villagers mispronounce but fear nonetheless. And one particularly juicy tale about a local miller who may or may not have shortchanged his customers with tricky measurements. A reminder that even in the Middle Ages, scandal was as cherished as scripture, and you stand there nodding, pretending to follow, while secretly marveling at how quickly solemn ritual has dissolved into lively chatter, as though the bell unlocked both piety and mischief. And you wonder, perhaps a little wickedly, whether half the congregation showed up more for the gossip than the gospel, though historians themselves still debate how deeply faith penetrated daily life, whether it was sincere devotion or pragmatic necessity. And you cannot help but smirk at the thought that even in a world without smartphones or hashtags, human beings were already experts at mixing reverence with rumor, holiness with habit. And so when the priest steps back into the sunlight, blessing the crowd with a gesture that looks equal parts holy and exhausted, you finally understand that the bell's power is not just to call you in, but to bind you together, reminding each person that survival here is not only physical, but communal, built on faith, fear, and maybe a little bit of nosy curiosity. And as the villagers disperse toward their next chores, you realize with a sinking feeling that your brief reprieve is over, and the rhythm of labor will claim you again, leaving you to wonder how many more bells you can endure before your body, or your patience, gives out entirely. The sunlight has shifted by the time you stumble away from the churchyard legs, stiff from standing still for far too long. But before you can even consider sneaking away to collapse on a hay bale, You are caught in the swell of villagers drifting toward the castle walls, the largest stone structure looming on the edge of the village, like a stubborn reminder of who truly holds the power here. And you cannot help but gape as the dirt lanes give way to a beaten path that winds upward toward gates studded with iron. Tall towers that look majestic from a distance, but up close reveal cracks, moss, and a distinct odor of stale dampness that suggests nobility does not necessarily equate to freshness. And as you cross the wooden drawbridge, creaking beneath your feet with unnerving groans, you realize that stepping into the castle is not just entering a building, but crossing into another world, one where wealth and privilege parade themselves through architecture, and yet somehow manage to feel colder, darker, and considerably more uncomfortable than the smoky cottage you left behind. And the first thing you notice is the draft, sneaking down the long corridors lined with tapestries that do a poor job of blocking wind, but a very fine job of collecting dust. And you wonder briefly whether the noble family ever walks these halls with the same sense of dread you feel, or whether they are too busy enjoying their symbolic superiority to care that their home resembles a particularly grim refrigerator. And as you shuffle along behind a small knot of servants carrying baskets, you are struck by the hierarchy, carved into every corner. Peasants bowing their heads, guards standing stiff with spears, and somewhere above, the Lord himself brooding in his solar, probably convinced he is the center of the universe, while you are just another muddy distraction. Though perhaps he is not entirely wrong, since the peasant's survival hinges as much on his whims as on the weather. And you remember reading that castles were not luxurious palaces as modern minds imagine, but defensive fortresses designed to endure siege, which makes sense the moment you peer through a narrow arrow slit and realize that while it offers a brilliant view for shooting enemies, it provides precisely no comfort if you are freezing inside, which explains why most noble families preferred to cluster around the hearth, layers of fur piled on, while servants dashed about fetching endless firewood. And as you trail deeper into the great hall, your eyes adjust to the dim light flickering from a few sputtering torches, and you marvel at the enormous space meant to inspire awe, with its high rafters and banners swaying faintly. Yet you cannot help but notice the scurrying rats along the edges, the stale scent of last night's feast, lingering unpleasantly, and the general sense that grandeur is more impressive in theory than in practice, for the wooden benches look about as comfortable as a pile of rocks, and the floor is slick with something you decide not to investigate. And as you drift toward the raised dais where the Lord's chair sits in pompous solitude, you picture him seated there, dispensing judgments or pretending to be magnanimous during feasts, and you wonder, not for the first time, how such pomp is maintained when the plumbing consists of a chamber pot and a very patient servant, which is perhaps the truest medieval paradox, grand ideals balanced precariously on very earthy realities. And while you muse, a servant thrusts a cup into your hand, some watered wine that tastes faintly of vinegar but is at least wet, and you sip, trying not to grimace while eavesdropping on gossip among the castle staff, who, like staff everywhere in every era, seem to know everything, their whispers covering topics from the Lord's questionable spending to the lady's newest embroidery project that has taken 3 months and looks suspiciously like the same flower, repeated 100 times, and you almost laugh out loud at how little has changed in human priorities. Money and needlework scandals, both timeless, and yet beneath the humor is the realization that life in the castle, though cushioned, is not without its own traps. For political alliances, rivalries, and even dinner seating could carry consequences sharper than any sword. And historians still debate whether lords truly believed themselves divinely appointed, or whether they spent half their time glancing nervously at rival nobles ready to undercut them. And you imagine the strain of constantly balancing authority with fear, luxury with drafts, banquets with dysentery, and suddenly you do not envy the lord at all, even if his chair does look more padded than the bench you are leaning against, though padded here is relative, since even his velvet cushion probably conceals a board as unforgiving as the judgmental gaze of his steward. And as your eyes roam upward to the rafters, you catch sight of a falcon tethered near the window, a noble's prized hunting companion glaring at you as if you are prey. And you remember that falconry was the medieval version of both sport and status symbol, though you cannot help but think it must have been awkward when the bird decided to leave own presence on the furniture. which likely explains the faint streaks staining the stone below. Another reminder that glamour fades quickly under the weight of reality, and as your gaze drops again, you notice the minstrels tuning their lutes in the corner. A faint promise of music that might fill this cavernous hall during feast nights. And though your stomach growls at the thought of roasted meats and spiced wine, you also know that the same feasts often ended with guests stumbling into corners to relieve themselves discreetly, because toilets were far from convenient, a fact rarely painted into romantic medieval tapestries, and you find yourself grinning at the absurdity of it all, marveling that this space intended to inspire awe reveals as much about human frailty as it does about power. And yet, despite the drafts, the smells, the rodents and the echoes, there is something magnetic about the castle, a sense that stepping through its halls connects you to centuries of whispered intrigue, of banners raised and lowered, of lords and ladies who believed themselves immortal, even as their bones now lie forgotten. And for a fleeting moment you feel the pull of history's current, tugging you deeper into its narrative, even as your body screams for rest and your lungs beg for fresh air. But before you can find either, a sudden clamor erupts from the training yard beyond the walls. Shouts, metal striking metal, the thud of boots on packed earth. And you are swept toward the sound because here in the shadow of authority lies the real heartbeat of the castle, the knight's domain, a place where chivalry and bruises meet. And though you do not yet know it, the next lesson will be even less forgiving than the drafts that haunt these stone walls. The first clash you hear is so sharp that it vibrates in your teeth, metal on metal ringing through the air with a violence that makes you flinch. And yet when you follow the noise out into the training yard, you discover that the combatants are not enemies locked in mortal battle, but rather two red-faced squires beating each other senseless with what appear to be wooden poles, the kind of training swords that a modern visitor might dismiss as toys until one squire swings with enough force to send the other sprawling into the mud, his helmet rattling like an overturned bucket, and you realize that even wooden weapons are capable of leaving you with a lifetime of headaches, if not a premature funeral. And as you linger at the edge of the yard, trying to avoid looking too obvious, the smell of sweat, horse dung, and scorched leather envelopes you, thick enough to make your nose twitch, while the soundscape is a constant chorus of thuds, shouts, and the occasional curse that would scandalize the priest if he were not too busy lecturing villagers about humility inside the church. And you realize that this is where the romantic image of knights in shining armor truly loses its polish, because up close the training ground looks less like gallant chivalry and more like a chaotic boot camp designed to break bodies before they ever reach a battlefield. And before you can sneak away, a burly knight notices you and waves you forward with a grin that contains far too many missing teeth to reassure you. His accent thick, his breath ripe with onions, and his insistence that you have a go utterly unshakable. So before long you are shoved into the arena, handed a wooden sword that feels like it weighs more than an anvil, and faced with an opponent who has clearly been waiting all morning for a chance to hit something softer than a straw dummy. And the first blow nearly knocks your arms from their sockets, reminding you instantly that medieval training was not a gentle warm-up, but a relentless grind designed to toughen boys into warriors. By the time most modern children are barely allowed to ride bicycles unsupervised, and as you stumble backward, mud clinging to your boots, the knight bellows encouragement that sounds more like threats, insisting you keep your feet moving. Swing harder. Stop looking like you are about to faint, which is difficult advice to follow when you are fairly certain you are about to faint, and you recall that knighthood was less about noble ideals than about years of brutal physical conditioning, beginning as a page in childhood, then enduring endless drills as a squire, and only after proving yourself repeatedly were you allowed the ceremonial tap of the sword that transformed you into a knight. Though by that point, most aspirants were already scarred, limping, or missing teeth, and you have barely survived 3 minutes before collapsing dramatically in the mud, to the mixed amusement and pity of the squires who mutter that you would not last a day on campaign, which, considering the state of your shoulders, is an understatement. And yet as you lie there, you cannot help noticing details that lend some truth to the chivalric image. Coats of arms painted carefully on shields, stacked by the wall, horses tethered nearby, gleaming with well-brushed manes, and even a young squire reciting an oath under his breath, as though practicing for the day. he will finally kneel before his lord to receive his spurs. And you realize that beneath the bruises, there is an aspiration, a dream of belonging to something larger, something that promises glory, land, and perhaps even a place in song. Though historians still debate how much of knighthood was genuine virtue and how much was public relations carefully cultivated by those who benefited most from the myth. And while you ponder this, a sudden cry pulls your attention toward the jousting lane, where two knights mount enormous horses, armor clattering as they settle into saddles designed less for comfort than for survival. And the lances they grip look absurdly long until the signal is given and they charge, the thunder of hooves vibrating through the ground as wood splinters against shields. And the impact is so violent you are convinced someone has died. Yet both knights rise, shaken but intact, while the crowd of squires cheer as if watching the medieval equivalent of professional wrestling. And you realize that for all its risks, jousting was both entertainment and training, a dangerous sport that built reputations and sometimes ended them in an instant. And you shiver at the thought that nobles once risked their lives to impress audiences with precisely the kind of spectacle that now leaves you struggling to keep your breakfast down. And perhaps the strangest part of all is that despite the bruises, the exhaustion, the broken bones, young men still flock to this life, driven by ambition, duty, or sheer lack of alternatives. And you cannot help but wonder whether it was courage, desperation, or simply the fact that in a world of mud and toil, the promise of armor and a horse was too intoxicating to resist. But whatever the reason, as you stagger out of the training yard, clutching your ribs and swearing never to pick up a wooden sword again, you cannot deny that knighthood was less about honor and more about endurance. And you, dear listener, have already proven you would not survive the warm-up, let alone the battlefield. Though the day is far from over, and another test awaits in a place far less glamorous but every bit as unsettling, the Healer S Hut, where cures may be worse than the diseases themselves. You limp from the training yard with arms that feel as if they have been hammered into pudding ribs, aching from the squire's enthusiastic blows, when a villager points you toward a crooked little hut on the edge of the village, explaining with a grin that you look as though you could use the healer's touch, though the way he says it carries more amusement than reassurance. And as you approach the hut, you notice how different it seems from the stone sturdiness of the church, or the drafty pride of the castle. For this place is sagging, patched with wattle and daub, herbs dangling in bundles from the eaves like some kind of vegetal warning, and the air is so thick with pungent smells that you can detect them before you even reach the door. A blend of garlic, rosemary, dried flowers, smoke, and something sharper that reminds you disturbingly of vinegar left too long in the sun. And when you duck your head to enter, the interior swallows you into a haze of smoke, rising from a low hearth where a cauldron bubbles with mysterious contents. And the light is so dim that you can only make out shapes, shelves crammed with jars of powders, animal bones hanging from strings, and leeches wriggling lazily in a clay pot as though waiting for their moment to shine. And just when you think you might quietly back out, a voice croaks from the shadows commanding you to sit, and out of the haze emerges the healer herself, a wiry woman with sharp eyes that seem to measure not only your injuries but your soul. And she wastes no time in poking at your bruised ribs with fingers that feel like twigs, tutting as though she has seen this exact brand of foolishness 1,000 times before, which, considering the number of squires who stagger in daily, she probably has. And without asking your preference, she reaches for a jar, smears something that smells suspiciously like rancid butter across your side, and mutters an incantation that you cannot decide is prayer, spell, or both. And you realize that in this world, medicine is as much ritual as science, a patchwork of remedies drawn from herbs, superstition, and centuries of trial and error, where error often meant the patient did not live to complain, and you try not to flinch as she next dips a rag into hot wine and presses it against your bruises, insisting that heat will balance the humors, a phrase you recall from a textbook about medieval medicine's obsession with balancing blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A theory that sounds suspiciously like trying to adjust the seasoning of soup rather than healing a body. And as she works, she lectures you about the dangers of cold air seeping into your bones, about spirits that wander if you leave your wounds untreated, and about the marvelous qualities of leeches which she gestures toward proudly, as if they are star pupils waiting in line for their turn. And before you can object, she plucks one from the jar and places it against your arm, where it latches with a determination that makes you squeak in a most undignified fashion, to which she simply smirks and mutters that a little bloodletting never harmed anyone, which history politely corrects as entirely untrue, though in fairness, some patients did seem to improve, perhaps because removing a pint of blood forced them to lie down and rest. You notice more details. The charms carved into the beams overhead, likely meant to ward off evil spirits. The row of skulls on a shelf that may once have belonged to animals, but are displayed with just enough ambiguity to make you uneasy. And the way her tools glint in the firelight, knives, probes, and iron implements that could either heal or terrify depending on how steady her hand happens to be. And you cannot help but think that in a world without anesthesia, surgery must have been an exercise in both bravery and screaming, though she insists proudly that she once removed an arrowhead from a man's leg while he drank only ale and bit down on a stick, and she describes this as routine, which tells you everything you need to know about survival rates. And while she speaks, you remember that healers were often women, sometimes respected, sometimes suspected of witchcraft, their reputation swinging wildly depending on whether their remedies succeeded, and historians still debate how much of their practice was genuine empirical knowledge of herbs and how much was ritual layered on top. But sitting here, sweating in the smoky room with a leech still attached to your arm, you realize that the line between science and magic was far thinner than modern minds prefer, and perhaps thinner than modern medicine admits. And though you feel queasy, you also feel oddly comforted, because beneath her muttering and sharp glances is a certainty that you lack a conviction that her remedies matter, that care itself is part of the cure. And even if you doubt the leech, you cannot doubt the warmth of being seen, poked ribs and all, by someone who has made it her life's work to patch up bodies battered by plows, swords, and accidents with buckets. And just when you start to relax, she abruptly pulls the leech off, drops it back in the pot with a satisfied plop, and presses a sprig of lavender into your hand, instructing you to sniff it whenever the world feels heavy, which seems a surprisingly gentle prescription. And though you leave the hut reeking faintly of garlic, butter, and smoke, you also feel strangely lighter, though whether from the herbs, the ritual, or the pint of blood you have lost you cannot say. And as you step back into the daylight blinking, you hear your stomach growl ferociously, reminding you that spiritual healing is all very well, but physical survival demands food. And just ahead, you see villagers gathering around a steaming pot, suspended over an open fire, and you realize it is time to experience the culinary wonder, or horror, of the midday meal. The smell reaches you before the sight does. A curling haze of wood smoke and boiled grain drifting through the village square, and your stomach, already growling from its earlier protest, seizes the chance to announce its hunger with such ferocity that a passing chicken actually flutters away in alarm. Though as you draw closer to the great communal pot, you begin to wonder if your appetite has made a terrible mistake, because the odor is not the savory perfume of roasted meat or freshly baked bread as your imagination first dared to hope, but rather the damp, earthy scent of barley and cabbage boiled far past recognition, with just the faintest trace of salted pork fat teasing your nose like a promise that will not be kept. And as you peer into the cauldron suspended over the flames, you behold the miracle of the medieval midday meal, pottage, that thick soupy porridge which served as breakfast, lunch, and dinner for peasants across the land. A culinary creation both endlessly adaptable and eternally disappointing. For it could contain anything from beans and onions to turnips and nettles, and in lucky times perhaps a scrap of meat or fish, though more often it was a greyish sludge that clung to the wooden spoon with the determination of plaster and slid reluctantly into your bowl with a sullen plop. Yet for all its unappetizing, each clutching a rough wooden bowl and spoon worn smooth from years of use, the queue itself buzzing with gossip about who has lost a pig, who has had a baby, and who might be suspected of stealing from the Lord's grain store. And when at last your bowl is filled steaming and thick, you take a tentative sip and are immediately overwhelmed by the flavor, or rather the absence of it, for it tastes of little more than hot water infused with a memory of cabbage. And you realize that medieval cooking for the average person was less about pleasure and more about fuel, so a way to stave off hunger rather than delight the senses. And though nobles dined on spiced venison, sugar-dusted almonds and imported wines, peasants ate what the land and season grudgingly provided, their diets shaped by the rhythm of harvests, fasts and famine. And as you chew dutifully, you notice how much work is embedded in every bite. For someone has chopped the vegetables with a dull knife, fetched water from the well, gathered firewood, and stirred the pot for hours to prevent burning, all before you ever lifted the spoon. And suddenly even this bland mush feels like a small miracle, especially when you consider the specter of famine that lurked over every harvest, ready to transform the dependable monotony of pottage into the despair of empty bowls. And you think of the chronicles that speak of desperate times when peasants mixed acorns, sawdust or ground-up bark into their meals, just to trick the stomach into feeling full, a grim reminder that survival was often about ingenuity under duress. And yet, as you watch children lick their spoons with contentment and old men chuckle between mouthfuls, you see that food was never just about calories. It was also about community. For here in the circle around the fire, you are not a lone sufferer, but part of a group. Your hunger shared, your relief mutual, and the very act of eating together weaves you into the fabric of village life. Though the illusion shatters when a bony dog snatches a crust of bread from your lap and dashes away pursued by curses. Because even in this moment of togetherness, scarcity breeds competition, and you notice how quickly bowls are scraped clean, how carefully mothers divide portions for their children, how no scrap is wasted, not even the soggy root ends floating in the pot. And when your own bowl is empty, you cannot help but lick it in imitation, realizing that etiquette here is practical rather than polite. And before long, the villagers disperse, returning to fields, looms and forges, for the work of survival waits for no one, least of all the daydreamer who lingers too long at the cooking fire and so still chewing a stubborn husk of barley caught between your teeth. You rise to follow the current of life once more, the weight of food in your belly both a comfort and a reminder that you must soon burn it off. And as the afternoon sun climbs higher, you are drawn toward the sound of hammering, the ringing strike of metal upon metal echoing across the village, a sound both harsh and rhythmic, summoning you to witness the world of medieval craftsmanship, where survival meant not only growing food, but shaping the very tools, weapons, and everyday objects upon which life depended. And though your stomach is full, your curiosity now hungers for the spectacle of fire and iron. The ringing grows sharper with every step, the steady clang of hammer against anvil reverberating like a heartbeat through the village air. And as you draw closer, the sound mixes with the hiss of quenched iron, the occasional grunt of exertion, and the acrid perfume of smoke and hot metal, until at last you stand before the blacksmith's forge, that fiery nucleus of medieval craftsmanship, where survival is shaped not only in fields and kitchens, but also in fire and steel. For here is where the plowshares that till the soil are born, the nails that hold roofs against the wind, the knives that chop vegetables into pottage, and of course the swords and arrowheads that remind you none of this community Greece fragile order exists without the ever-present possibility of violence. And the blacksmith himself looms in the doorway, sleeves rolled to reveal arms like knotted rope, his face streaked with soot and sweat that drips in rivulets down his brow, though his eyes are sharp and alive with the glow of someone who holds both power and responsibility. For in this world, the smith is more than a craftsman. He is a lifeline, and villagers treat him with a mixture of awe and cautious respect, knowing he can mend a broken plow but also supply the Lord Yearsmen with weapons to enforce order. And as you step inside the dim, smoky workshop, you are enveloped by heat, the forge itself blazing like a captured sun, its bellows wheezing under the rhythm of a boy apprentice who works tirelessly to feed air into the fire, his hair sticking damply to his forehead as he avoids his master's gaze. And your eyes follow the movement of tongs, lifting a glowing orange bar of iron from the coals, laying it upon the anvil, and then clang, clang, clang. The hammer descends each strike, flattening and shaping the metal with sparks that leap outward like tiny stars before vanishing into the gloom. And though it looks chaotic, you realize there is a rhythm here, a deliberate pattern of blows, a knowledge passed down from smith to apprentice for generations. For medieval metallurgy was both science and sorcery, part chemistry and part mystery, with recipes for tempering and quenching guarded as fiercely as family secrets. And historians still debate whether blacksmiths were sometimes viewed with suspicion, their mastery of fire and transformation bordering on the magical in the eyes of illiterate peasants. But here in this workshop it feels less like sorcery and more like survival, for the village needs hinges for doors, horseshoes for travel, sickles for harvest, and even mundane items like cauldrons or nails, each painstakingly made by hand. A reminder that in an age without factories, every object bore the intimate signature of labor, and you cannot help but imagine how expensive time itself must feel when every nail in the Lourdes barn roof was hammered into being one by one. No mass production, only repetition, sweat, and patience. And yet there is beauty in this too, in the sparks dancing against the shadows, in the iron slowly transforming under precise strikes, in the quiet partnership between the smith and his apprentice who anticipate each other as movements without words. And though your ears ring from the constant hammering, you find yourself lulled by its rhythm, as though the forge itself is breathing, inhaling with the bellows, exhaling with each blow, a steady pulse that anchors you to the very mechanics of survival. And then the smith pauses, plunges the glowing blade into a barrel of water, steam hissing upward in a ghostly cloud that stings your eyes and smells faintly of wet ash. And when he withdraws the metal, you see it hardened, darkened, ready for the next stage of shaping. And you think about how such a tool, whether a hoe or a dagger, carries in it the essence of life and death, the power to feed or to kill, to build or to destroy. And as you lean against the workshop's rough wall, you notice a pile of broken tools waiting for repair. Their edges dulled, their handles snapped, and you are reminded that survival here is not only about creation, but also about maintenance, the endless cycle of fixing, mending, and reshaping. Because nothing is disposable, every object is too precious, and you chuckle at the thought of a medieval villager watching modern people throw away a bent spoon as though it were useless, when here even the smallest shard of iron is treasured reforged, given another life. And as the blacksmith wipes his brow with a soot-stained rag, you catch him grumble about the Lourdes tax collectors, who will soon demand yet another quota of nails and horseshoes, a reminder that even the strongest arms cannot hammer away the weight of feudal obligations. And you realize that no matter how skilled one was, survival in this era always carried the shadow of authority and duty. But before the thought can drag you into gloom, the apprentice drops the tongs with a clatter, and the smith bellows at him in a string of colorful insults that makes you laugh out loud, because even in the midst of all this sweat and fire, there is room for humor, for human clumsiness, for the small slip that reminds everyone they are only human. And as the laughter fades, you step back into the sunlight, your ears still buzzing with phantom hammer blows, your clothes faintly scented with smoke, and you realize that you carry a piece of that forge with you now, the memory of sparks and iron shaping your understanding of how survival was not only toil in the fields, but also the artistry of hands that bent the raw elements of earth into tools of endurance. And as the day stretches on, the hammering fading behind you, you feel yourself drawn toward the heart of the village, where the chatter of voices grows louder, the bustle more animated, and you know the market awaits. A place where food, goods, and gossip mingle together, offering not only survival but also the faintest glimpse of joy in a world so dominated by necessity. The voices reach you first, layered and overlapping in a jumble that feels almost musical. A chorus of bartering laughter and the occasional sharp complaint rising above the general din. And as you follow the sound toward the village square, you see that the once quiet open space has transformed into a riot of color and movement. For today is market day, and if the forge was the heart of medieval craftsmanship, then the market is surely the bloodstream, pulsing with the flow of goods, gossip, and grudgingly counted coins. And the moment you step into its orbit, you are nearly bowled over by a woman balancing a basket of eels that writhe in protest at their fate, their slick bodies gleaming in the sunlight like discarded ribbons, while behind her, a child calls out the price of onions, with a voice so shrill it could shatter pottery. Though no one seems to mind, because this cacophony is what survival here sounds like. A place where vegetables pulled from gardens, cheese aged in smoky cottages, cloth dyed with woad, and even a suspicious-looking pile of imported spices change hands with a mixture of enthusiasm and suspicion, and you quickly realize that shopping in this world is less about neat stalls and polite queues, and more about elbowing your way close enough to inspect a wheel of cheese, or sniff a loaf of bread before someone else decides it looks tastier. And while you are being jostled from one side to another, you hear the sing-song pitch of a peddler, extolling the virtues of his wares, a bundle of charms he swears will cure gout, ward off witches, and keep husbands faithful, which seems like far too much responsibility for a handful of knotted string. Yet a woman nearby buys too with such earnest conviction that you decide it is best not to scoff, because in a world where disease, bad luck, and infidelity are daily hazards, perhaps even a placebo woven from twine offers more comfort than logic ever could. And then, out of the corner of your eye, you spot something more appealing. A baker with a tray of golden brown loaves whose aroma cuts cleanly through the smells of fish, livestock, and sweaty peasants. And though the price makes you hesitate, you could buy a small chicken for the same amount. You remember the taste of pottage still lingering in your mouth and decide that maybe splurging on bread is a worthwhile rebellion against monotony. So you hand over your few coins and clutch the warm loaf like a prize, tearing off a hunk that practically steams in your hand. Its crust crisp, its crumbs soft and slightly sour. A reminder that amidst all the hardship, there are still small luxuries to be savored. And as you chew, you wander further, noticing how the market is not only a place of goods, but also of information, because every conversation around you is part trade, part news, part theatre, with farmers grumbling about the weather, shepherds boasting of their flocks, and travellers spinning tales of distant towns that may or may not exist. For in a world without newspapers or reliable maps, gossip is the currency as vital as bread, and you linger near a group whispering about a nearby village where the miller has mysteriously vanished, perhaps abducted by fairies, or perhaps simply run off with another man's wife, though no one agrees on which version is true. And you realize that markets serve as medieval internet, delivering a blend of fact, rumor, and wild invention all in one noisy feed. And just as you are thinking how pleasant this chaos is, a sudden commotion ripples through the crowd. For a goose has escaped its tether and now flaps furiously between stalls, knocking over baskets of apples and scattering children in delighted pursuit, while its owner chases after it with a string of oaths that could curdle milk. And the scene is so absurd that you cannot help but laugh, though no one else seems particularly surprised, because chaos is simply part of market day's charm. And yet beneath the comedy, you sense the deeper stakes, for behind every cheerful haggle lies the thin edge of survival, because a bad sale could mean less food for winter. A spoiled batch of ale could ruin a family's fortune, and a clever trade might spell the difference between hardship and comfort. And historians still debate whether peasants truly had disposable income, or whether markets were more about barter and obligation than profit. But standing here amid the noise and the bargaining, you feel the reality more keenly than any ledger can show. These exchanges are lifelines, every coin a fragile link in the chain of survival. And as the sun climbs higher, the market swells. Musicians appear with fiddles and drums to lure buyers with merry tunes. Jugglers toss wooden balls for tips, and a tooth drawer shouts loudly about his miraculous ability to end pain with one swift yank, though his bloody apron suggests the cure may be worse than the disease. And you wince as a poor man climbs onto the stool and opens his mouth in surrender, the crowd cheering louder for the spectacle than the patient. And you realize the market is also theatre, a place where survival meets entertainment, where you come not only to trade but to laugh, to witness, to connect, and to remember that even in an age of hardship, people craved diversion. So you push through the crowd once more, clutching your loaf of bread, ears still ringing with music, arguments, and the quacking protests of a captured goose. And as the square begins to empty with the afternoon waning, you follow the flow of villagers back toward their homes, realizing that the excitement of market day will soon give way to evening routines, for survival does not rest. And though you feel pleasantly full from bread and laughter, the rhythm of the village continues to pull you along, guiding you toward quieter, darker corners where faith, superstition, and ritual intertwine, waiting to show you how the medieval mind sought not only food and tools, but also meaning in a world that could vanish as quickly as a coin slipped from one palm to another. The market's noise fades behind you, replaced by the softer murmur of evening, the lowing of cattle returning to their sheds, the rhythmic creak of carts, and the faint chime of a church bell, carried lazily on the breeze. And as you follow that sound toward the stone building at the edge of the village, you feel the atmosphere shifting, as though the laughter and bargaining of the square has dissolved into something heavier, steadier. For here lies not trade but faith. And though the church is small, its rough stones lichen-streaked, its wooden door warped by weather, it stands taller than any hut around it, an anchor not only of religion but of community itself. Because in this world, survival is not merely about food and tools. It is about belief, ritual, and the sense that something larger than toil and taxes might be watching. Though whether that presence is comforting or terrifying depends on which priest you ask. And as you step inside the dim interior, the air is cooler, carrying the mingled scents of beeswax candles, damp stone, and faint incense. A sensory cocktail that tells you immediately you are no longer in the practical realm of haggling and hammering, but in a place where mysteries are entertained, where survival is not measured in calories but in souls. And you take in the sight of villagers kneeling on the bare floor, murmuring prayers in Latin they do not understand, but recite anyway. Because in repetition there is comfort, in rhythm there is familiarity, and though the theology may be incomprehensible, the ritual itself is a survival strategy, a way of navigating a world of famine, plague, and uncertainty by placing trust in something invisible. And as you watch the priest shuffle forward in vestments that seem too fine for this modest village, you wonder how many here actually feel divine presence, and how many simply hope the gestures will keep them safe, because historians still debate whether medieval faith was deeply internal or more of a communal obligation. But looking at the weary faces around you, you see little difference, for the act itself seems to hold power regardless of personal conviction. A binding glue that tells each person they are not alone in their struggles. And yet, outside this official faith, the air of superstition hums just as strongly, for you recall the woman at the market buying charms, and here too, you spot a villager furtively tying a scrap of cloth to a beam near the altar, a practice said to draw healing for the sick, though the priest either does not notice or pretends not to, because the line between holy ritual and folk magic is blurred, often tolerated so long as it keeps people calm. And you smile faintly at the thought that medieval people believed in saints and relics, while also fearing witches and fairies, mixing doctrines and superstitions into one messy but oddly functional worldview. And as the prayers end and the villagers file out, you walk with them into the twilight where smoke curls from chimneys and the sky deepens to purple. And you hear a mother warning her child not to wander near the woods after dark, lest spirits carry him off, while another woman spits 3 times over her shoulder to ward off misfortune after tripping on a stone. And you realize that these gestures, small and habitual, are every bit as vital as food or shelter, for they give structure to fear, turning chaos into something that feels at least partially controllable. And you remember chronicles that tell of villagers gathering to ring church bells during storms, believing the sound would chase away demons in the clouds. And though it may seem absurd, you cannot deny the comfort of believing your actions have power. And perhaps even in your own time, such rituals are not so far removed from knocking on wood or avoiding cracked mirrors. Though here they are infused with far more urgency, because when illness sweeps through a cottage or crops fail without warning, superstition is not a game, but a strategy, however flawed, to survive the unexplainable. And as night deepens, you join a small procession toward the churchyard, where flickering candles mark a vigil for the dead, villagers murmuring prayers for ancestors whose souls they hope are at peace. Though the whispered tales of restless spirits suggest doubt lingers, and you cannot help but wonder if the soft rustling in the trees is merely the wind or something more. Because in this twilight world, faith and fear mingle seamlessly, both offering a kind of protection, both shaping how people endure the hardships of existence. And while you stand among them, candlelight dancing across your face, you realize that even if you scoff at some of their beliefs, you too feel soothed by the ritual, lulled by the rhythm of prayers and the glow of shared light against the dark. And so when the vigil ends and villagers drift back to their homes, you walk slowly, mind heavy with thoughts of saints and spirits, charms and chants, realizing that survival here is as much about the unseen as it is about the tangible. And as you reach the edge of the village, you see a path leading toward open fields now silvered with moonlight, where shadows stretch long, and the night's chill begins to bite, and something in you knows the journey is not done. For survival is also about weathering the elements themselves, and soon you will have to face the long, cold, unpredictable embrace of the medieval night. The path beneath your feet turns pale in the moonlight, each stone and clump of earth washed in silver, and though the village is now hushed behind you, a faint glow from its hearth fires marking its presence in the dark. You are struck by just how immense and unsettling the medieval night feels. For without the hum of electricity or the comfort of street lamps, the world is reduced to shadows and sounds, and you suddenly understand why so many feared the hours after dusk, when the familiar world of fields and cottages dissolved into an unfamiliar landscape of rustling hedges, snapping twigs, and the low hoot of an owl that sounds almost like a warning, and you pull your cloak tighter, realizing that cold seeps more aggressively when there are no radiators or hot water bottles waiting for you at home, only a fire that takes effort to keep alive, and even then, smoke stings your eyes and wood supplies dwindle faster than you would like. So you understand why villagers went to bed early. Not from laziness, but from pragmatism, because once the sun disappeared, there was little sense in wasting precious fuel on light. And yet here you are wandering, every breath clouding in the chill air, each gust of wind setting branches creaking in a way that makes you quicken your step. And though part of you laughs at your own nerves, you remember that for medieval people, the night was not only inconvenient, but dangerous. For thieves and outlaws often waited for darkness to cover their crimes. Wolves prowled the edges of settlements, and worse still, the imagination populated every dark corner with demons, witches, and spirits eager to prey on the unwary. And while historians argue about how seriously such fears were held, you cannot ignore how convincing they feel in this setting, with the shadows dancing just at the edge of your vision and the silence pressing in between each unfamiliar sound, and you stumble slightly on a root cursing softly, only to hear what you swear is a laugh carried faintly by the wind, though perhaps it is only your mind playing tricks, or perhaps some villager's tale of mischievous spirits was not entirely invented, and you realize how cleverly fear shapes behavior, keeping most people indoors at night, tucked close to hearth and family, their survival aided not by courage but by caution. Yet for those forced to travel, like merchants or messengers, the night demanded strategies, carrying lanterns that illuminated little but made you feel braver, traveling in groups or stopping at roadside inns whose straw beds and sour ale seemed luxurious compared to the dangers of stumbling through darkness. And as you pause to listen, the rustling of a hedgerow makes your skin prickle, and you picture the stories of will-o'-the-wisps, flickering lights said to lure travelers into bogs where they vanished forever, though modern minds explain them as marsh gases. Still, out here in the gloom with nothing but your imagination to fill the silence, science feels very far away. Yet when you glance upward, the sky itself offers consolation, for without pollution the stars spill across the heavens in dazzling clarity, the Milky Way, a luminous river overhead. For many peasants who never traveled far, could gaze upon the same sky night after night, weaving it into stories, timing their planting by its patterns, how lovers whispered beneath constellations, whose shapes carried myths older than the church itself, and suddenly the night feels less hostile and more vast, a realm of mystery that both frightened and inspired its dual nature, as cruel and comforting as the firelight you wish you had. And though your breath is steadying, the cold creeps deeper. Your toes numb inside worn shoes, and you imagine how brutal winter nights must have been when frost coated inside walls and families huddled together for warmth, praying the woodpile would last until dawn, the long hours broken only by restless dreams, or the howl of wolves carried across frozen fields, and you shiver despite yourself, grateful that at least this night is mild, though your comfort falters when the faint sound of footsteps echoes behind you, quick, uneven, as though someone or something is following, and you resist the urge to look, telling yourself it is nothing, only the echo of your own tread. But the sound grows louder until you spin around, heart thudding, only to find nothing but swaying grass and the long shadows of trees, and you laugh shakily, realizing how easily fear spins itself from darkness. And perhaps this was the real terror of the medieval night, not wolves or spirits, but the endless canvas for the human mind to paint its anxieties upon, a reminder that survival depended as much on enduring fear as on enduring hunger. And as you finally spot the glow of a cottage ahead, smoke curling faintly from its chimney, you feel relief bloom in your chest, because night in this world is best spent behind closed doors, near the protective crackle of fire and the heavy wooden door bolted shut against whatever roams the fields. And as you approach, the door creaks open and a hand beckons you inside, into the dim, smoky warmth where weary villagers already lie curled on straw mats, their day of labor behind them, their hopes pinned on surviving to see dawn's pale light once again. You stumble from the smoky warmth of that peasant hut into the idea of sickness, because in medieval times you wouldn't get to choose whether you stayed healthy or not. Germs didn't ask for permission, and medicine wasn't so much a cure as it was a guessing game, a mixture of prayers, herbs, and sometimes outright superstition that tried desperately to fill the gap between ignorance and survival. And as you sit now by the hearth fire, knees tucked under your chin, you hear the raspy cough of the old man on the straw bed across from you, a cough that rattles deep in his chest and makes you flinch, because without antibiotics or even the concept of bacteria, a simple chest infection could drag on until it ended with silence, and your own throat feels dry, just listening, your mind whispering, what if, because here the smallest fever could spiral into something deadly? And you remember that the people around you would have thought illness wasn't just about bad luck or poor hygiene, but about humors, the four invisible fluids, blood phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, that supposedly dictated everything from your mood to your health. And so when you complained of a headache, someone might recommend bleeding you, literally cutting your vein to let out the excess blood they believed had gathered. And as horrifying as that sounds in your 21st century ears, back then it was one of the most trusted treatments performed by barbers who doubled as surgeons. The same hands that cut hair, also cutting into skin, and you imagine the sting of a rusty blade, the bowl filling with your blood, and the barber nodding as though this is progress, as though weakness pouring out of your body is somehow health returning. And you realize how terrifying it must have felt to be sick in this time, to have no guarantees, no Tylenol to dull the fever, no vaccines to shield you from smallpox or measles, and instead you'd rely on charms, whispered prayers, pilgrimages, to relics that promised miraculous cures and herbs whose effectiveness was sometimes real, but often exaggerated, like garlic pressed to wounds or chamomile steeped for stomach aches, small mercies in a world of uncertainty. But the true horror is how fast illness spreads in crowded villages. For picture it, houses packed close together, animals sharing the same space as humans, waste thrown into ditches, water drawn from wells, too near to latrines, and into this stew of germs steps the reality of plague. A word you know all too well, the Black Death sweeping across Europe in the mid-14th century, killing millions, and here in this village, even the mention of it causes silence, eyes darting to the door as though death itself might be listening. Because when plague came, there was no hope, no protection, bodies piling faster than they could be buried, whole families disappearing overnight, and priests reciting prayers over mass graves, their voices cracking with fear. And you can almost hear the sound of carts rolling down narrow streets, wheels creaking, men shouting, "Bring out your dead!" The stench of rot rising into the air, the buzzing of flies thick enough to sound like static, and you realize that you, with your fragile immune system shaped by modern medicine, wouldn't stand a chance. You'd be swept away before you could even protest, your survival odds shrinking with each cough that echoed in the cramped darkness of these medieval huts. And yet, sickness wasn't always so dramatic. Sometimes it was slow, grinding misery, the kind that never left, like aching joints from arthritis, or teeth rotting down to the gums. Because dentistry was little more than yanking a tooth with pliers and hoping the infection didn't kill you. And as you touch your own teeth now, tongue brushing nervously against smooth enamel, you imagine the sharp flash of pain as a molar cracked the swelling jaw that followed the way infection could creep into the bloodstream, with no antibiotics to stop it, and you shudder, grateful you were born far from this nightmare, but also fascinated, because somehow people endured. Mothers birthing children with no sterile wards, wounds healing under crusts of honey or moldy bread pressed against the skin, and sometimes those remedies worked, by accident or by nature, because honey really does fight bacteria, and mold, the accidental source of penicillin, was there long before Fleming noticed it under a microscope. But in the medieval mind, it was not science. It was providence, or the will of God, or perhaps the influence of demons, and the explanations mattered less than the result. Sometimes you lived, sometimes you died. The scariest part is the rituals of healing, because imagine lying feverish skin, clammy breath shallow, and a physician, if you were rich enough to afford one, arrives not with stethoscopes or pills, but with a leather bag of instruments, leeches, squirming in jars, knives for lancing boils, ointments of ground pearls or powdered viper's flesh, and he examines your urine in a glass flask, holding it up to the light to judge its color, as though the golden or cloudy hue alone can reveal your fate. And he strokes his beard, muttering about an imbalance of humors while you sweat and tremble, knowing his remedies may well worsen your agony, but you accept them, because what else is there? And even the wealthiest king suffered, Henry VIII nearly consumed by ulcers, his flesh putrid, his doctors helpless, or Charles II given a concoction of powdered human skull. In his final hours, the great monarch reduced to desperate experiments. And then you consider childbirth again, that brutal ordeal already haunting you from earlier. For without midwives' herbs or skilled hands, without clean blades or the faintest idea of antisepsis, infection after birth was one of the greatest killers of women. And how helpless it must have felt for a husband to watch his wife fade, or for a mother to cradle a newborn whose tiny cough foretold a short, sorrowful life. And you realize that survival here was a constant gamble, not just against hunger or cold, but against your own body, your own fragile health. A game weighted heavily against you, the dice loaded by ignorance and chance. Yet there was resilience too, because medieval people weren't fools. They observed patterns, they learned which herbs soothed fevers, which diets strengthened the weak, and monasteries became centers of medical knowledge, copying texts, tending gardens of medicinal plants, experimenting with remedies that would centuries later form the roots of modern pharmacology. And you feel a strange admiration for those who struggled forward without the tools you take for granted, carving meaning out of chaos, fighting back against invisible enemies with prayer, persistence, and hope. And though you know you wouldn't last a day in this world, coughing and fever would fell you quickly, you also know that in their shoes you would do the same. Cling to any cure trust, any ritual whisper, any prayer. Because survival in medieval medicine was never about certainty, it was about endurance, about holding on just long enough to see the dawn and hope the sickness passed you by. You sit there now, hunched in the smoky glow of the hearth where we left off, the echoes of coughing and whispered prayers still hanging in the air. And though the smell of rosemary and garlic lingers faintly, as though someone somewhere is trying one last herbal remedy, the truth is clear to you. Surviving even a single day in this world of mud, smoke, and superstition feels less like an achievable task and more like a cruel dare, because every direction you turn, some new discomfort or danger waits to snatch away your modern sense of comfort. And yet you keep walking forward with me, your guide through these endless lanes and crooked alleys, because you are stubborn, because curiosity is heavier than fear, because perhaps deep down you want to test how far your fragile 21st century self could make it before giving up. And so we wander together through this final stretch of medieval life, reflecting on everything you have endured and everything you absolutely would not endure if you truly had to live here. You think back to food, that watery pottage with its occasional lump of mystery meat, and your stomach curls at the memory, your palate mourning the absence of coffee, chocolate, and even a humble slice of bread not filled with grit from a millstone, because your modern teeth would crack quickly under such punishment. And perhaps you remember the endless work, the bending of your back in muddy fields, your skin rubbed raw by wool that never truly softens, and the way your muscles never got to rest for idleness was not an option here. And if you dared to take a moment to lean against the fence and sigh, someone, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps the Lord's steward, would surely bark at you to keep moving, keep working, because time was life and laziness was sin. And you think, was there ever a moment of joy here? Something that balanced the misery, and surprisingly there was. For life was not unrelenting gloom. It was also festivals in the village square, bonfires crackling, jugglers tossing flaming sticks, neighbors laughing after too much ale, children shrieking as they chased one another between the legs of goats. And even you feel your lips twitch into something like a smile, because joy did exist here, though it came rarely and burned bright only against the backdrop of hardship, like sparks in darkness. And perhaps that is the real lesson that seeps into you now. Not that you would die instantly in medieval times, though yes, you almost certainly would. But that survival here was not simply about avoiding death. It was about stringing together enough small joys, enough fleeting comforts to make the constant threats bearable. And you imagine yourself trying to do the same, trying to hold on to a good laugh, a song sung badly but loudly, a stolen apple from a cart a moment by the river, where the breeze actually smells clean, and maybe that would be enough to remind you that life then, however fragile, was still life worth clinging to. As you stroll further, the streets narrow again, crooked beams leaning overhead, and your boots squelch in something you do not want to identify. And you shake your head because this world was loud, smelly, crowded, filled with barking dogs and crowing roosters, the clatter of blacksmith hammers, the shrieks of vendors peddling onions, garlic, and fish that probably should have retired from the market 2 days ago. And you realize how every sense would have been under siege, your nose assaulted, your ears never at peace, your eyes straining in the dim light of candles that sputtered more smoke than illumination, and your skin perpetually itchy from wool, fleas, or just the damp chill that crept into every layer of clothing. Yet within this chaos, people thrived not in the way you define thriving with spreadsheets, air conditioning, and Wi-Fi, but in the way a weed thrives in a crack of stone, stubborn and uninvited yet persistent. And maybe that persistence is why humanity crawled its way from these muddy lanes to your modern world of electric lights and ibuprofen. And maybe you are meant to feel grateful as you stand here tugging your cloak tighter, that you do not live here permanently, that this is a dreamlike visit, a nighttime wander with no consequences. Because if you truly stayed, you would discover quickly that gratitude alone cannot keep you alive. And speaking of staying, you glance at the church tower looming above, bells silent for now, and you remember how faith ruled here, how every cough, every strange rash, every poor harvest was explained not by microbes or weather patterns, but by the will of God, or the mischief of demons, or perhaps the curse of your neighbor who glared too long at your cow. And you think, would you have believed this too if you had grown up here? Would you have knelt on stone floors until your knees ached? Would you have crossed yourself at the sound of thunder? Would you have worn a charm of bone or bronze to keep the spirits away? And the uncomfortable answer is yes, because survival here required belief as much as bread. It required a narrative that made sense of suffering, and even you, rational skeptic of the modern age, might have bowed your head because everyone else did, and because hope in invisible protection was better than no hope at all. And the irony is not lost on you that even your modern world clings to little rituals, lucky socks, knocking on wood, whispering good luck, that are not so far removed from medieval charms, only tidied up, dressed in irony, but still feeding that ancient human need for control in a world that so often refuses to be controlled. You step into the marketplace, imagining it buzzing with barter, the scents of spices, leather, sweat, hand manure weaving together, and you hear the gossip. For gossip was the medieval newspaper, spreading faster than any scribe could copy a text, and you lean closer listening as neighbors whisper about who was seen carrying wood to the forest when they should not, who sold watered-down ale, who let their goat wander into the Lord's meadow, and you laugh quietly, realizing that survival here was also political, not grand politics with crowns and castles, but tiny politics of who smiled at whom, who owed whom a favor, who kept secrets and who spilled them, and your survival might hinge less on your ability to swing a sword and more on your ability to stay liked or at least tolerated, because exile from the web of community here was worse than death. It was death stretched slowly over time. You touch the rough wood of a stall and feel splinters snagging your skin, and you imagine trying to sell your own goods, maybe clumsy carvings, maybe a basket woven badly, and you know they would laugh, your hands too soft, your patience too thin. But still, you would try because hunger would push you to it, because in this world effort mattered more than outcome, and even a crooked basket could buy a handful of onions to see you through the week. And you think of how resilient the human spirit must be to seek joy, even in the shadow of death. And you wonder if that is the real miracle of this age, not the relics or the pilgrimages, or the leeches in their jars, but the laughter that somehow managed to echo through it all. And in that thought you find a strange calm, because perhaps you would not survive a day here physically, But maybe, just maybe, you would still find one moment of laughter before you collapsed from plague, starvation, or simply exhaustion. And that moment would mean something, as it meant something for them. Now the day winds down, shadows lengthen, the marketplace empties, and you follow me back through crooked lanes toward the edge of the village, where fields stretch out under the fading glow of twilight, and you breathe the air, damp and earthy, tinged with the smell of wood smoke curling lazily upward. And you think of how this day has been, how your back aches though you have only imagined work, how your stomach feels hollow though you have not truly missed a meal, and how your lungs feel tight from the thought of coughing. And yet you have walked the full circle from dawn's frost to night's hearth, and you survived, if only in imagination. And now it is time to step back, to return to your own time, your own world of comforts and clean water, your own bed waiting in the stillness of your room. And as you step across that invisible threshold, you carry with you a new awareness, that survival here was never guaranteed, that comfort was rare, that joy was fleeting but powerful, and that you, blessed with modern luxuries, would do well to remember this whenever you grumble at a slow internet connection or a broken coffee machine. Because compared to the mud, the fleas, the hunger, and the fear of medieval life, those small inconveniences are nothing, and survival in your world is not merely possible. It is so effortless you forget to notice it. You rise from that quiet meadow where we left off, the stars fading a little, the air still damp with dew, and though you might wish to linger, the medieval world does not stand still for dreamers, so you are swept along onto the road, or rather, what passes for a road, which in this case is a strip of dirt gouged by wagon wheels and softened into mud by last night's rain, and immediately you feel your shoes, those borrowed, ill-fitting leather things, sink into the muck with a rude squelch. Because travel in these times was not a matter of leisure, but of survival, necessity, or sometimes pure desperation. And here you are trudging forward with aching calves, your cloak heavy on your shoulders, and me beside you, amused at how quickly your modern sense of convenience collapses at the first taste of medieval transport. You look ahead and see the great ruts that wagons have carved deep into the soil puddles glinting, and you wonder if this really counts as infrastructure. And yes, technically it does, for these were the arteries of the age, the paths that carried pilgrims to shrines, traders to markets, soldiers to war, and the occasional unlucky traveler to their doom at the hands of bandits, who, by the way, are rumored to haunt the forest just beyond that bend. So perhaps keep your eyes up. And do not comfort yourself with the idea of inns dotted along the way like modern highway rest stops, because outside of towns, such luxuries were scarce, and even when you did find an inn, it might resemble a smoky hall where you share a straw bed with flea strangers, and perhaps a chicken or two, all while the landlord eyes your purse with thinly veiled calculation. You glance back wistfully, already missing the relative safety of the village you left. But forward is the only direction you can move, so forward you go each step, reminding you that medieval travel was as much an ordeal as any plague or famine, and only the hardiest or most desperate attempted it. And perhaps you ask yourself, why travel at all in this unforgiving world? And the answer comes in many forms. For peasants, it might mean carrying surplus grain to a market 2 towns over, a journey of days that eats up whatever small profit the grain might fetch. For pilgrims, it means trudging hundreds of miles to kneel before relics said to cure illnesses or shorten time in purgatory, and you picture yourself joining such a procession. The shuffle of sandals, the muttered prayers, the banners flapping weakly in the breeze. And though your feet ache, you admit there is a strange comfort in moving as a group, a kind of spiritual caravan where misery is shared and therefore halved. For merchants, travel means risking brigands, storms, and rotten roads in order to sell bolts of cloth, spices, or trinkets from distant lands. And yet roads were not merely pathways of danger. They were lifelines carrying not only goods, but ideas, songs, and gossip, so that even the most isolated hamlet felt faint ripples of the wider world, a whisper of news from a far-off kingdom, a joke that had traveled hundreds of miles, or a tune picked up from a wandering minstrel. And you realize that even here, in mud and exhaustion, humanity... Still, you cannot ignore the lurking menace of travel. The forest ahead looms thick, its branches knotting together like clasped fingers, shadows pooling under every tree, and though the air is still, your mind supplies every possible sound. Footsteps behind you, twigs snapping, low murmurs just out of reach. and you remember the tales told by firesides of highwaymen with knives and clubs. Besides, horses attract attention, and attention on the road is the last thing you want, because the thin line between a traveler and a target is drawn by what jingles in your pouch and how boldly you appear to defend it. You touch your own purse, thin and pathetic, and hope that any thief peering through the branches decides you are not worth the trouble. And yet, not all on the road is misery. As the day stretches and your steps fall into a rhythm, you hear the tinkle of bells, and soon you overtake a group of pilgrims, their staff tips knocking against stones, their satchels light because poverty is expected on such journeys, their eyes bright with a mix of exhaustion and faith, and they greet you kindly, one offering a crust of bread, another a swallow of ale from a leather flask. And though both taste of mildew, you accept them gratefully because hunger and thirst flatten your standards quickly. You march together, listening to their stories. The woman who dreams of healing her childish fever through a saint's touch, the old man who seeks forgiveness for sins he will not confess, the young boy giddy at the thought of seeing a city for the first time, and their voices blend with the birdsong and the clatter of hooves from a passing merchant cart, until the road itself feels alive with motion, a river of humanity flowing endlessly between towns, castles, and shrines. And in this moment you realize travel here, for all its hardship, is also intoxicating. For it widens horizons, fills the ears with strange dialects, fills the eyes with landscapes beyond one's own field or village green, and you suspect that even medieval peasants, though tied to land by duty and poverty, felt a thrill in these rare excursions, as though glimpsing a world larger than they had ever dared imagine. Of course, your body is not thrilled, and by the time the sun sinks low, your legs are jelly, your back screams, and you would sell your dignity for a soft bed. But instead, you find yourself in a roadside alehouse, where the benches are hard, the floor littered with straw, and the air thick with the smell of onions, sweat, and spilt beer. You share the table with strangers, one of whom snores mid-sentence, another of whom eyes your pouch with unnerving interest. And though you try to relax, you cannot ignore the fleas hopping merrily across your sleeve, or the fact that you will be expected to share a bed with 3 other travelers, all of whom look as though they have not bathed since last spring. You sigh, reminding yourself that this was travel in the Middle Ages, exhausting, dangerous, and deeply uncomfortable, yet also rich in stories, encounters, and the sense of belonging to something wider than your own muddy plot of land. You settle in, grateful at least for a roof over your head, and drift into uneasy rest, listening to the creak of beams, the snort of horses outside, and the laughter of drinkers long into the night, until finally silence falls, heavy and absolute, and you realize you have survived another day, another step along the endless road of medieval life. You wake the next morning with your bones stiff from the alehouse straw, your hair carrying the fragrance of smoke, spilled beer, and perhaps one too many fleas, and though the idea of another day's march makes you want to sink back into oblivion, the pull of the road urges you on, and so you rise, rubbing your eyes, adjusting your cloak and stepping once more into the uncertain daylight of a medieval morning, the air damp, the sky a soft grey, and the sound of roosters echoing faintly from scattered farms. You walk, half dreaming, until the land begins to shift, the rutted road widening, the huts thinning, and suddenly, rising ahead like something out of legend, you see it. The silhouette of a castle perched on a hill, walls bristling with towers, pennants fluttering weakly in the morning wind. And for a moment you feel the breath catch in your throat. For this is the beating heart of medieval power, the fortress where lords ruled, where knights schemed, where courts of intrigue hummed with whispers. And as your feet carry you closer, every stone tells a story, every arrow slit a promise of defense, every looming gate a threshold between the dangerous road and the illusion of security within. And yet you know that castles were not merely romantic symbols of chivalry, they were instruments of domination, designed to loom over peasants as much as repel invaders. And as you climb the hill toward its gates, you wonder whether you are approaching protection or another form of oppression. The drawbridge creaks as carts roll in, laden with grain, firewood, and barrels of ale, and you blend into the throng, head lowered, trying to appear as though you belong, and soon you are swallowed by the gatehouse, its portcullis a menacing iron grin above your head, guards on either side eyeing every face, every bundle, every suspicious twitch of hand or purse. Inside, the courtyard bursts with life. Chickens scuttle underfoot, dogs bark at each other, blacksmiths hammer at glowing iron, and children dart between legs. Their laughter mingling with the clatter of hooves and the shouts of merchants setting up stalls. And you realize that for all its towers and battlements, a castle was as much a bustling town as a fortress, its walls enclosing not only warriors but cooks, masons, scribes, servants, jesters, and that curious category of hanger-on, who somehow managed to live off scraps without ever producing anything tangible. You drift toward the great hall, drawn by the smell of roasting meat, and inside you find a cavernous chamber, beams heavy with smoke stains, tapestries flapping slightly in the draught, long trestle tables set with trenchers of coarse bread and bowls of pottage, while at the far end, raised upon a dais, sits the lord of this domain, his robes lined with fur, his fingers heavy with rings, and his expression carefully sculpted into a mask of benevolence laced with menace. You lower your gaze, because to stare too boldly risks insult, and insult risks punishment, and punishment here rarely means a slap on the wrist. Around him stand knights, their chainmail clinking faintly as they shift, their faces flushed with pride or boredom, their eyes darting toward the minstrels tuning lutes in the corner, because even warriors enjoy a little background music while posturing. You watch as food is carried in, roasted boar, steaming pies, pitchers of ale. And though the smell makes your stomach twist with hunger, you notice the division. The lord and his chosen few dine richly upon venison and spiced wine, while further down the table, lesser folk content themselves with watery stew, stale bread, and perhaps a scrap of salted fish if they are lucky. You are given the latter, and though your modern taste buds complain, your medieval hunger overrides and you eat quietly, watching as the lord gestures to a scribe, who unrolls parchment and begins reciting the latest decrees. New taxes levied, new lands seized, new punishments decreed for disobedience. And though the peasants nod, you see the flicker of resentment in their eyes, a flicker that centuries from now will burn into rebellion. But for now, here, smolders silently under the weight of armored power. The feast continues, with jesters tumbling clumsily, minstrels plucking at strings, and knights boasting loudly of jousts won and foes slain, their words echoing off the stone like a chorus of egos. And though part of you is entranced by the pageantry, another part of you, the part that remembers mud roads, hungry peasants, and plague-stricken villages, wonders at the cost of all this glitter. For castles were built not only of stone, but of labor, sweat, and suffering. Each tower a monument to the peasants who hauled stones until their backs broke. Each banquet financed by taxes squeezed from fields barely able to feed families. And you feel the weight of that truth pressing in even as laughter fills the hall. Later, as the hall empties, you wander the corridors, the air cool and musty, the walls lined with faded tapestries, and you peek into chambers. A chapel where a lone monk murmurs prayers by candlelight, a guardroom where men snore in heaps, a solar where noblewomen sew by firelight, their needles flashing like tiny sparks, their voices weaving gossip and complaint. And in these quieter spaces, the castle feels less like a stage and more like a hive, buzzing with lives that intersect and collide, each tiny drama feeding into the larger machinery of power. Eventually you climb a winding stair, your hand trailing along the cold stone, until you emerge atop the battlements, and the view steals your breath. Below lies the winding road you trudged, the patchwork of fields stitched across the valley, the forest looming like a dark sea and far beyond. Faint in the haze, the suggestion of other villages, other towers, other lives unfolding just as weary and just as brief. The wind whips at your cloak, carrying with it the cries of merchants below, the clang of the smithy, the distant bark of a dog, and you feel suddenly very small, a tiny figure caught between the great stones of power and the endless stretch of land beyond. And yet in that smallness a strange comfort blooms, for you realize that this was the truth of medieval life, to be part of something vast, dangerous and fleeting, to live with hardship, but also with moments of beauty, laughter and connection, to endure day by day in a world that asked much and gave little, but still managed to glimmer with humanity. And as you lean against the wall, watching the sky darken into twilight, torches flickering below like stars pulled to earth, You feel the weight of centuries press gently against you. Not cruelly, but like a heavy blanket, and your thoughts begin to drift soft and unmoored. The noise of the courtyard fades. The stone under your hand warms strangely, and your eyelids grow heavier still, until the banners on the towers blur into waves. The torches melt into fireflies, and the murmurs of the medieval world dissolve into a soft hum, like a lullaby carried on wind. You breathe slow and steady your body, loosening your mind, folding inward, and as the castle fades into shadow, you realize the journey has ended not in triumph or tragedy, but in rest, the kind of rest that outlasts roads, plagues, and even time itself. The medieval world drifts away, the torches dim, and you are left only with the hush of silence, the steady beat of your own heart and the gentle pull of sleep deeper and deeper, until at last there is nothing but quiet. You stir again as if from a dream within a dream, your body no longer seated on the cold battlements of stone, but moving slowly, almost unconsciously, down a winding dirt track that seems to slope away from the castle, its torches receding behind you like a constellation of fading stars. And though you do not recall deciding to leave, your feet carry you steadily forward, the night air cool and damp, the smell of wet earth rising with every step, and the sense that this is the last long path of the journey settles quietly over you like a second cloak, heavier but strangely comforting. For the medieval world has taught you that there is always another road, another test, another uneasy bed. But tonight it feels more like a gentle farewell, as though the very land itself is easing you out, rather than pushing you along. The track passes through hedgerows, their branches clawing at the sky, and in the distance you see the faint glow of lanterns bobbing, a group of pilgrims, ragged yet determined, their voices carrying snatches of hymns that sound weary but steady, and you fall in beside them unnoticed at first, your pace matching theirs. And one turns to you with a gap-toothed smile, his eyes glinting in the firelight, and he offers you a piece of bread that tastes of dust and salt, but fills the hollow ache in your stomach all the same. And for a moment, you understand why people sought out these roads, not only for salvation or penance, but for the simple comfort of walking together through a world too heavy to face alone. You listen as they talk of relics glimpsed in far cathedrals, of saints who bled or wept or turned their gaze toward peasants in fields. And though part of you wonders how much of it is truth, and how much is wishful storytelling, another part of you finds the rhythm of their voices soothing, the way the words blend with the steady crunch of boots on gravel, a lullaby of shared endurance. One pilgrim speaks of Santiago, another of Canterbury, and another of a tiny chapel where a spring is said to heal wounds, though historians still wonder whether such springs offered more hope than cure. And yet here they are, still believing, still walking, and you realize belief itself was perhaps the real medicine, one that kept bodies moving when logic would have them collapse. You walk on, your eyes adjusting to the soft moonlight that silvers the fields, where sheep lie scattered like stones, their wool catching the light, and owls drift silently overhead, their wings cutting the air without sound. And for a moment, the medieval night feels less frightening than it ever has, less filled with bandits and wolves, and more like a great breathing presence that watches but does not strike. Still, you know the dangers remain. For even as the pilgrims hum a hymn, the road passes a gibbet where a skeleton sways faintly, its bones clattering like wind chimes, a reminder that not all who wandered survived, and yet the pilgrims nod to it calmly, as if death is not a terror but merely another marker on the map, another inn at the end of the road, and you feel the strange peace of that acceptance sink into your own chest. You travel with them for what feels like hours, though time stretches and folds in the dark, until the road dips into a valley where a brook babbles softly, and here they pause to rest, unrolling thin blankets, muttering prayers, and one by one falling into slumber. Their lanterns extinguished until only the stars remain, and you too find yourself lowering to the grass, the earth cool beneath your back, the sky vast above you, and the sounds of the medieval night, so full of danger and life, soften into background noise, a texture of crickets, water, and distant bells. You realize then that this is the true farewell, not the castle's stone silence, not the plague's lingering cough. You close your eyes, the grass pressing against your palms, and in the half-sleep between worlds you see flashes, The muddy village where you began, the rattling carts, the herbs hanging from rafters, the clatter of armor, the hush of cloisters, the market stalls, the jesters' bells, the lord's heavy rings, the torches flickering on high walls, all of them drifting like fragments of a tapestry, unweaving until the threads dissolve one by one, softer, slower fading. Your breathing slows, longer now, each exhale carrying the centuries away. Even the stars dim, and there is nothing left but the gentle rhythm of sleep, steady and endless, the truest survival of all. You feel yourself drifting further down that soft medieval road, yet the urgency of travel has slipped away entirely, as if the soles of your feet no longer need to push against stones or mud, and instead, each step is carried by some quiet rhythm older than castles, older than plagues, older even than the first tilled field. And though the darkness of the world around you is complete, it does not feel threatening anymore. It feels like velvet, stretched wide in every direction, gently wrapping your shoulders as if the very air itself wanted you to rest. So you breathe deeply, slowly, the way you might breathe while standing at the edge of a calm sea at night, where the waves rise and fall without urgency. And as you exhale the last of the day's tension, you notice how your body, once busy with mud and carts and flickering torches, has become heavier, softer, more inclined toward stillness. You sense that the journey, which once was filled with hungry peasants, gossiping monks, coughing plague carts, and ambitious lords, has narrowed now into something simpler, a soft bed of grass beneath you, a ceiling of stars above, and the slow recognition that nothing more is required of you. No tax to pay, no market to navigate, no pestle of herbs to grind. And in that recognition comes an odd relief, the kind of relief that makes your shoulders unclench without you noticing, the kind of relief that pulls your thoughts not outward but inward, where each breath itself is its own story. You lie back, feeling the curve of the earth beneath your spine, as if the planet itself were a giant cradle, rocking you in rhythms too ancient to measure, and you notice the sounds fading one by one. First the pilgrim's murmurs, then the chirp of insects, then the brooks bubbling until even the faintest noises stretch further and further away, replaced only by the steadiness of your breathing, long and slow, in and out, like the tide of an unseen ocean. Your eyes grow heavy, though you are not sure if they are open or closed anymore, for the stars blur into drifting lanterns, and the lanterns into warm motes of color that swirl and dissolve like threads of smoke. And in that haze, you sense other images, small fragments of the medieval world you walked through, but they no longer clamor for attention. They float softly as if painted on water. The crooked smile of a tavern keeper, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the flutter of banners, the hush of monks in candlelight, the jingle of a jester's bells, each one rising like a bubble, gleaming faintly, then popping into quiet. You let them pass without trying to hold them, because there is nothing to hold anymore, only drifting. Your breathing deepens again, slower still, as though the body has decided it is finally safe, finally free to surrender, and you feel warmth pooling in your chest, spreading down through your arms, through your stomach, into your legs, until even your toes feel distant, soft, and light, no longer gripping the earth, no longer needing to walk. A soft breeze brushes your cheek, and you imagine it is the world itself whispering that you have done enough, that there is nothing more required, that survival has transformed into rest, and rest will transform into sleep. You allow the thought to melt you, allow your body to sink, and in that sinking time itself dissolves because there is no hourglass in dreams, no bell tower striking, no rooster calling dawn. There is only this endless exhale, this unmeasured stillness, this deepening quiet. Your mind, once busy with curious facts and small sarcastic observations, now finds humor only in the simplicity of surrender, the cosmic little joke that after all your wandering, after all your imagining of what it might take to last in a medieval world, the only thing truly asked of you is to lie down, close your eyes and drift into the oldest tradition of all, sleep. And so you let go of the castle walls, you let go of the roads, you let go of the chatter of villagers, and you even let go of yourself, until you are nothing more than a breath in the dark, a rhythm, a softness, an unpinned fragment of the long story of the world, carried gently toward dreams. You breathe once more, in and out, slower, deeper, softer, until the world fades entirely.